Welcome to CTO Think, a podcast about leadership, product development, and tech decisions between two recovering chief technology officers. Here are your hosts, Don Vandemark and Randy Burgess.
Hey, Randy, what's going on in your world this week?
Oh, in our world, we just launched This Old App podcast.
For sure.
So folks listening to this show that want to perhaps hear about more, detail, ground level tech can head over to This Old App online, which is where we're hosting the new podcast. We have published 3 episodes. First one being an intro. The second one, we talk about how we, as experienced developers, are learning more JavaScript, which there's a difference between how you learn things later in your career versus how you began. So I think we have some insight there for how people can get on the JavaScript train if they've been avoiding it, as I did for a while. And the third one is an interview with a new developer and her forays into CSS Grid. So we've got 3 episodes up there, and they are available for downloading. Otherwise, preparing for doing project management level stuff has been most of my week, trying to get estimates for a project with a new client, and as well as doing some kind of emergency authorization type work for a client that decided a few employees shouldn't be able to delete things that they were previously able to delete. So a little bit of a quick coding work, a little bit of project management, and some substantial amount of podcast development, more than I had planned on, but we kind of decided to ramp that up pretty quick. What's going on for you?
Yeah, so same as far as the podcasting world and the other project we're running together.
Yep.
And then for Aspire EDU, we also have we ran into a small little issue over the last week, so that raised the whole discussion on testing and what. It's not that we don't do it; it's that a change was made that was not caught in our testing. Mm-hmm. So we had some discussion around coverage, and is there a way we should increase it, and we're continuing those discussions. So we've talked about that on here before.
Yeah.
So won't dive too much into that, but as it relates to the other product we're building, and as it relates to other things as well, we've talked in the past about how do you make a decision what stack you're going to use, what language are you going to program in, what database are you going to frame things around, yep. Where are you going to host it, the whole stack there. And I think we mentioned that we were going to bring it up at some point, and yep. Mark Thompson, one of our listeners, said absolutely he'd love to hear us talk about it. So we're gonna jump in the discussion this time. So yep. For the project we're building currently, we chose to go with a Node.js, Express, Firebase currently for data store. Base and let's talk a little bit. We won't get into the nitty-gritty details of those technically, but let's talk a little bit about how we arrived at that decision.
Well, I guess maybe for the listener, I don't know that everyone knows what a tech stack is on a definition level. So a tech stack in our world, you mentioned this, it is all of if you have a product, it is all the tech, but usually in the past, it was more all your back end tech because you were just spitting out HTML and CSS to the browser. Now it's largely a back and front end as we've made the browser clients more powerful. It's all the tech that goes in from the code to the DevOps to the frameworks and the plugins and everything else you use to get that product to market. And it's no longer a factor of what a company having one tech stack. The bigger a company is, they may have several. In our smaller business world, we tend to kind of focus on one per company and one per product, but it doesn't work that way for a lot of firms. And you can tell by their job listings where they're asking for a JavaScript front end developer on one hand, and then they've got a need for a Java developer, probably because they're doing Android native or something on the other. So when it comes to tech stacks, I think you kind of look at it on two different approaches of what a mature company is willing to employ for a tech stack and what a brand new startup is going to use for their tech stack. So I don't know how you want to approach the discussion about it. You want to talk about how we chose our current one, or do you want to talk about how we've chosen ones in the past and leads up to what we're choosing?
Well, let's talk about all of it. Let's talk about what goes into making those decisions. What factors? So for the product we're building, we chose the Node, Express, Firebase stack mainly based on Node is kind of one of those things that we're both trying to dig into a bit more. So we felt that this was a good project to really hone the skills on.
Yeah.
Whenever you do Node, Express is kind of the default choice when it comes to a web server. But then we kind of went back and forth on Firebase as far as a database versus a relational database like Postgres. And I think that was also a choice on let's use this project as a learning environment so that we can dive deeper into Firebase. That's not the way you're going to make your typical decisions when you're building a production product.
Yeah. So
you're not going to build it around let's go learn on it. It's going to be more on what do you know, what can you get. So go ahead.
So like going back to my first CTO job, we were on the tech stack of Microsoft. And so I think a big factor for a majority of CTO technical managers is what is in place already? What do you inherit? So when I started at the financial firm as a CTO, everybody had Windows desktops. The accounting system was based on Microsoft Access. So that was another Microsoft product. Everyone used Excel for their spreadsheets. And so every decision I made started from what do they have now and what are they really willing to invest that would deviate from that. And over 10 years, we stayed on the Microsoft stack, mainly because it's good enterprise software. The license fees weren't too high for what we were doing. In the financial space, there was a lot of development and support for Microsoft. We weren't a small firm kind of going against the grain. There's lots of financial companies at a big scale that were using Microsoft. And I personally learned more Microsoft at that time. I stayed on that stack in my own life using SQL Server as the database, using .NET for web-based side projects, and sticking with Microsoft Office for communications and spreadsheet work and documents. But that was because it was low risk, and I could find consultants to hire on behalf of the company easily. And so the input that went in there was affordability, accessibility to development and developers, the low risk choice of the stack, the stability of the stack, how much information was available online, which was a pretty good amount. We didn't have Stack Overflow at a strong amount, like as accessible as it is now. But there's plenty of Google searches that could get you answers to problems that you would find in the Microsoft stack. So those are all the factors that went into that particular choice for an established company. And I would say that the low risk factor was a big one for me, in the sense that if something were to go wrong, and if someone said, "Why did you choose that Microsoft stack to be on?" I could kind of be like, "Why wouldn't I?" There wasn't really some alternative that I would be looking like, "Wow, you really took the company in a weird direction by jumping on PHP for a financial firm." So
Yeah, the old phrase that used to be "no one gets fired for choosing IBM" became "no one gets fired for choosing Microsoft," right?
Exactly. So those were the factors that went into the financial firm being on Microsoft. Now, when I left that company, the first thing I did was jump onto the LAMP stack, and that is an open source based stack with Linux. Apache is the A, that's the web server. The M stands for MySQL database, and then P is PHP. And using that stack, I started work in Drupal development, content management system platform. And I spent the next probably 2 years strongly focused on LAMP type of technologies and development. But that was when I was no longer working for a firm. Or in terms of, I no longer was CTO at a firm where I was responsible for all tech. I was now doing client-based work on website projects. And so everything changed in the scope of what I was expecting out of a stack.
So let me stop you there real quick. Did the fact that all of those were open source, did that open source and therefore license free, paid license free, play a part in the decision?
It did. When I made that when I switched over, it was definitely important, because I was now no longer guaranteed a salary and benefits from a previous company. It mattered to my clients because they didn't want to pay for software when the alternative was, I don't have to pay for the software, I just pay for the labor. So now I made it clear to all my clients, we are using open source. This is at the time, it wasn't brand new, but it wasn't mainstream like it is now. And so I had to tell my clients, hey, by the way, we're going to be using libraries that the person maintaining some of these libraries could just quit. You can't do anything about it. And there's risk in that. But the alternative is pay these license fees to Microsoft. And they would always be like, how many big companies are using these open source things? I'm like, a good number. And they're like, do you think someone, like the entire ecosystem, would quit on this? I'm like, I doubt it, but it's possible. And they're like, we'll roll the dice. It's worth it on the charge. So I think it is a big deal that license fees are not part of the stack for why people are switching to open source stacks. I still think that's a driver when you look at enterprise level fees and licensing for code.
For sure. I know when I started on the LAMP stack, and I think I started a little earlier than you did. You were still on the Microsoft then, and I was on LAMP. A lot of what drove my decision was I can get all this for free. I don't have to pay Microsoft a few $100s for the TechNet CD that got you all the licenses and all the programs you needed, that sort of thing. So now this was probably late 90s, maybe into the 2000s, but yeah, that played a part for me as well. So after LampStack, you personally moved on to Ruby and Rails.
Yes.
What drove you that direction?
Oh, definitely community. Community and best practices. So I went and worked for, I went and talked to a company, DevMind software at the time. They had just started out. And I had said, hey, if you guys are looking for consultants, I'd like to, work with you. And they just said, well, we are Ruby on Rails based, and do you have any skills in that? And I'm like, not really. They're like, well, we can't take you on right now. So I'm like, okay, makes sense. I didn't have the skill set that they really needed, and they were new. So I went and worked for a company, Vibes Media. I talked about them in the past. And Vibes they were a .NET stack at the time for their entire company. But what they needed to do was start building more mobile apps, more web-based presence. And they could not find any developers, or I would say not willing to pay maybe developers at the time to do that. And I told them straight up, I don't know Ruby on Rails, but I want to. So if you hire me, I'll learn it and do it. And they're like, that sounds good enough. We'll, like the other attributes you bring. So I learned Ruby on Rails using, I think, what was the web server was at the time. I can't even remember. It was a Ruby on Rails stack, Ruby stack on Linux or Mac and Linux. So I basically did a full switch. I got off of Windows computers. I went to Mac. I started doing Ruby on Rails. And then that also brought in the need to learn some JavaScript, at least with jQuery as the main framework for the front end. And I just started cranking out tons of work based on Ruby on Rails. And so now Vibes had a new stack in their company that my team was essentially running by itself in that sense, compared to the rest of the team still doing Microsoft stuff. And then 8 months later, I talked to DevMind again, and they're like, hey, you've got the skills we need to hire. How about let's do this? And I joined DevMind and pretty much worked strictly on the Ruby on Rails stack for about 2 years. And the reason I was motivated from the Vibes to the DevMind to get into Ruby on Rails was a lot about the development community and the ease of adopting it. Ruby, compared to any language I've ever learned, is the easiest coding language to learn. And we've talked about this in the past maybe on this old app. The code base, the syntax is extremely easy to read, and it's almost geared so that it reads like English if you follow some of the patterns that conventions that they push, as well as it's local to Chicago. The lead developer, the inventor of Ruby on Rails, is based out of Chicago. A guy named David Hanmeyer Hansen out of Basecamp. His company used his framework, Ruby on Rails, to build a product. And as a result, there was a big following in Chicago around Ruby on Rails development. And what they did is they took kind of all the nasty pieces of the PHP stack and said, here, we're going to use a new language called Ruby to be the basis for this framework. And we're going to have a lot of conventions, best practices, and things you should do to make this framework work. And so you should not kind of wing it like you do in the PHP world at the time. You should really follow how we tell you to do things, and then you'll have a working product. And frankly, at that point in my career, I was happy to have some direction. I was happy to have people smarter than me say, this is the way you should do this. And I moved from struggling in PHP to get things to work all the time to just follow these steps and you will get things done. And Rails, even to this day, continually has a feature set and they have a testing paradigm that people follow that allows you to onboard quick and get things done. And that's immediately what I felt when I moved to that stack. So it was a terrific move for me on a career basis because I felt like I suddenly had the stable code base to build things, and building things helps you learn faster than anything else. But now, at the same time I was doing that, you were starting up with Aspire EDU, and you didn't go the Ruby on Rails stack way. So I'm curious about when you started with Aspire, how are you all on the stack you're on now?
Sure. So that was a decision. Like I said, I was full LAMP stack at the time. I had dabbled in Rails, but I did not have the same feeling as you did with it. Just different experience.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't in a position to switch over to a Mac, and to me, when I tried to, it came down to quite simply, when I tried to install Rails on Linux or on Linux on Windows, it was a pain in the neck.
Yep.
It was so painful to do so that I was just turned off by it.
But
so anyway,
let me break in. That's not a bad reason. I mean, your laptop is part of the stack. Your device of development is part of the stack. So I don't blame you. They've made it easier since, but there's a reason why Ruby on Rails is only 7% of development across the world now. And part of it has to do with, can everyone use it? So go ahead, continue.
Yeah.
But that's a valid reason not to get on a stack.
For sure. It comes back to first impressions, right?
Yep.
So what we did is when we were looking to build Aspire EDU, I had my LAMP background, but we had and the learning management system we were going to start with, Canvas, was built in Ruby. So that I was leaning either direction to start. But then when we were looking for a developer to build the system, the developer we found was a Python developer. He had Canvas knowledge. He had a little knowledge of what was in the API, but his knowledge was Python.
Yep.
So when I was talking to him, we talked about, okay, do we go with Python, which I don't know? Do we go with PHP, which he doesn't know, but he'll be in the weeds and can pick up on it fairly quickly. And I finally made the decision to take the risk that we would jump into a stack that I didn't know, mainly because the developer had to be the one comfortable. I didn't have to be comfortable. I was allowed to be uncomfortable. But the developer had to be comfortable because otherwise we were just going to get stuck. So
let's freeze on that, because that's a terrific example of a technical leader can make a choice based not on what they personally know, but based on what the team knows. Because in a way, the team is the extension of the manager. And you don't have to choose. You can choose a tech stack that you personally can't roll up your sleeves and work in immediately, because you have the people on staff that can do that for you. And so I've actually talked to companies where they've hired a CTO, and the CTO says, I think I'm going to switch this entire project over to what I know. And I'm like, that's crazy talk to me, to think that it matters what you personally know for a team of like 10 to 15 developers, and you're going to cause that much change in the stack because of your personal knowledge versus everything that's been invested, everything that's been built, and all the people that are there right now. So I always thought that was a really strong choice on your behalf, because you had a developer with a skill set. And it wasn't like Python. Python had a good reputation
Oh, sure.
and has grown even bigger. I mean, in a way, you made the better bet. If you compare the growth of Python across the country versus what Rails has kind of flatlined on growth. I'm not saying that in a negative way. I still feel like Rails is highly productive, but if you look at how things have changed over the last decade, other frameworks have taken off, and Python is in that mix too.
So let's really take the train off the tracks for a minute then, and talk about why Python's gained in popularity, because it's been the last 2 or 3 years where it kind of was flat, and then all of a sudden it jumped up, and it jumped because of all the emphasis on data.
Yeah,
and Python had some libraries that were really strong in data, and they've only gone and made them even better. So your data analysts, your data scientists, your machine learning people, it's a couple languages out there. It's R and it's Python.
yep.
Now I personally love R. I've spent some time with R, but if I think, and the R people can come hunt me down if they need to. I think if you're going to build a full-fledged application, Python's your better choice. If you're just looking to crunch some data, R is pretty solid.
R is like a Buick or an Oldsmobile. Sorry. But I mean, it's like it's an old tech that works, and if you know it, you're going to stick with it.
And again, this was so we'll try and put the train back on the tracks a little. When I was learning data analysis based on Aspire EDU being having analytics component, I wanted to dive into it a bit. I dove in. I'm like, okay, this particular tutorial series is based in R, so I'll go with R. And then I did one on Python as well, thinking, well, now I'll do an analytics series on Python, which is what Aspire EDU is written in. And again, I didn't have an issue of installing this time. It was an issue of, you know what, I've used R and I've used Python, and R is just so much easier to get things done.
Yeah.
Now, I'll go back to, I think if you're trying to build something a little fuller, Python's going to be the way to go. But if you're just trying to crunch something, R is pretty darn quick to pick up.
But here's why I didn't get into Python. Every time I looked at Python, I would look at the community, and for at least the last number of years, there's been this divide on the Python 2 versus Python 3 thing. And for the life of me, I can never get a straight answer. Which of these two libraries should I be using? And when I would try to look up Stack Overflow issues, it was never clear. Am I dealing with a 2 or 3 issue? Should I be using 2 or 3? And is this community going to completely fork and be doing things like kind of left and right?
Interesting. Okay.
And so I had this concern, whether it was unfounded or not. Every time I looked at the stack, I was like, this is not the stack that I feel is solid. But understand that at the same time, people on the West Coast in the Valley, Silicon Valley, were like all on board the Python train. The data community was on the Python train. New York was on the Python train. And I was like, okay, let me look at Django, which is the equivalent of Ruby on Rails, the kind of the web-based framework. And when I would look at Django, I'm like, Django is missing a ton of the libraries and magic that Ruby on Rails has. Why in God's name would I switch when I am so productive in Ruby on Rails? There's no question about there's not a fork in the Ruby community. It almost happened, but it didn't happen. And I was part of a community in Chicago that was bought into Rails. And I'm like, I just never could go full blast into learning more Python or Django because I was really comfortable in the lazy boy of Rails that I had at my in my community here. So that's why I didn't get into Python.
And I wanted to bring it up, but you brought it up instead, so that's fine. It really fascinates me how much a city matters.
Yeah.
Because if DHH was in New York or LA or Seattle or not Chicago,
Yeah.
would you have ended up on Rails? Who knows?
Yeah.
We can't play that game. But it fascinates me how much a city matters in a decision like that, and it absolutely does.
Yeah.
We talked about remote work and we talked about all that, but for somebody to be comfortable working remote, they have to have a community supporting them, and
Yeah.
it is easier to have a local community support you than a remote one. So anyway, we ended up going Python Django. We've been adding players to the team along the way that have that strength. One thing I am finding as we go to hire more Python people, I'm having to filter through qualifications of, oh, this person knows Python, but it's all in the data analysis libraries.
Yeah.
It's not on the Django side. So I'm having to, it's hard to filter that way because you can't say Python. Now, I can search on Django and that works, but you can't really search on Python because of the explosion of the data community.
Yeah.
So we talked about a couple different stacks there. And we talked about how we arrived at those decisions. Let's talk real quick about one piece of the stack, because we've been mostly focusing on the language.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the database. And this is not a MySQL versus Postgres discussion or a Mongo versus Firebase discussion. This is a relational database versus NoSQL.
That's really an episode in and of itself, but it's part of the stack, so it's worth mentioning at least.
Sure.
I mean, I grew up in relational databases. I feel
everybody did.
Yeah,
nobody grew up in NoSQL except for the young folks.
Yeah, exactly. And so the whippersnappers are getting introduced to JSON at the beginning. But for us, I mean, our world started in spreadsheets, Lotus 1, 2, 3, if you are that old, and Excel became the powerhouse, which is in itself the basis for a relational database in many ways. And so you start out learning, you start learning Excel, you migrate to maybe Microsoft Access. Then MySQL comes along. SQL Server was the powerhouse version of my MS Access. And then Postgres showed up. And for the majority of projects, learning SQL and using relational databases was pretty much the stack you were introduced to for how to use databases, how to persist data. And then there wasn't some major paradigm shift, different way of thinking about it. That's all the way up to about 10 years ago. I mean, when did
it probably started creeping in, but it really didn't get a hot and bothered until probably 6-7 years ago.
Yeah.
That your story in and of itself was fascinating because you started with spreadsheets.
Yeah.
That's not how I started with relational databases. And it's just a difference in our background. In our computer science classes in college, I remember the maroon relational database book. I loved that book. I loved relational databases. Made so much sense to me just because of the way they were ordered.
Yeah.
And then that led to hey, I can use spreadsheets to do the same thing. So I had almost the flip of that, which is utterly fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah.
But then we did have this introduction of the NoSQL community stack, whatever you want to say, which every time I tried to dig into it, I'm like, this makes no sense. It's so unordered. Where this is chaos. Now, since then, I've had the opportunity to do one or two things in it, and I'm starting to see the benefits in it, and the fact that not everything has to be as ordered as you like them in a relational database. And sometimes having it the way it's set up is more performant than a relational database can be.
I watched on that note, I watched some videos the other night on modeling NoSQL, and
there's no such thing.
two I know, right? Two subjects came up: purposefully denormalizing your database, having repeating data across different documents, and multi-path updates to maintain consistency. Basically meaning you may have a whole user document with a username and everything, and you may have another document or collection that has user data associated. And then in our relation world, you have an ID that links those things. But in the case of NoSQL, you may just take that user profile and shove it into the other collection. And I've never wanted to punch a video tutorial person in the face so much. Like, hey man, I know what you're saying, but this is wrong. This is wrong, and you need to be punished for saying this. And I still, but the thing I did is I read the comments in the video, and it was on YouTube. I read the comments below, mainly to see like how many people agree with me. And there were people that agreed, and there were people that were explaining why you need to get off that thought process. And you said performant. And I think that's what it comes down to is we have grown up in this world where normalized data isn't repeated throughout the system. It's linked through references, and performance online in a world of click events and multiple connected users requires a different data store. I still want to punch that guy in the face just for saying it, but I think he doesn't deserve it. He doesn't deserve that abuse.
I think we may have found our next guest.
Not if he hears me talk about the violence. But yeah, it's hard to the idea to move across those stacks of persistence layer. It's hard when you've grown up in that one side, and it works. Like, I'm not motivated to move to the NoSQL that much. I can get so much done in the SQL side. And I know lots of developers. I've had this conversation with people so many times of the echo chamber of the SQL devotees that I know. And we keep on looking at the NoSQL side. We're like, why are you doing that to yourself? Like, why make it that hard? And so I'm still on the fence, but I'm warming up to the idea.
But here's I had 2 points, and I had another point, but you just said something. I got to grab a hold of that.
Sure.
What I have to grab a hold of is the fact that you said echo chamber, the term echo chamber.
Yes.
So why did you and I choose to use Firebase for this product we're building?
Should we talk about the conversation we had Saturday first?
That is all part of it. So we initially said when we were building this, we were like, Firebase SQL, what do we want to do? And at the end of the day, we said we're going to use Firebase because we're going to try and learn something as we're building this. And then Saturday, you said,
I don't want to learn this anymore. I basically I was in a ball. Well, I was curled up in a ball on the floor crying, saying, I don't want to do this anymore. SQL works fine. I'm going to just figure out how to do Node and Postgres.
But as a CTO, do you now feel you're in a better position to start evaluating when you might be able to use NoSQL properly?
Oh, yeah.
Were you in that position a week ago?
Well, there's two sides to it. I was approaching it as a CTO. When we were talking at the abstract level, what stack should we use? I had the opinion, yeah, we should go down the NoSQL route. We're building a mobile message platform. Speed is a big deal. That's what NoSQL folks, and scalability, because we expect a high volume of storage, which is what the NoSQL community pretty much says are the two biggest things for why it's a good platform. When I got in, rolled up the sleeves, started looking at the code, I suddenly found myself in a position where, wait a second, I don't have a community and I don't have a developer that knows this, which was me. So I started flipping to, now I'm using a tool set where I have to relearn a bunch of stuff. In the SQL world, I can find out answers to problems like boom, because I know the vocabulary, I know the context.
Because there's 50 years of history on relational database.
Yeah. And exactly. And I don't know who online I can trust for the NoSQL advice. I still, even to right now, I'm still not sure on, okay, I get the denormalized thing, but what's the best way? Like, where do I go too far? I know in Postgres and MySQL, I know the extremes of like, don't go near that cliff because you'll fall over the edge. There's no need to do that. I don't know I'm in a pitch black ledge, and I'm not sure if the next step is 2 feet down or a 20-foot drop.
All right, so, but let's get back to my point, which was, I think you're a better CTO today because of that you're diving into building a project on something you don't know, so that when you have that decision point to make in the future, you now have more experience on both sides of the fence. And there are going to have to be some times when you're going to have to choose that uncomfortable thing.
Yeah.
But we both made the decision, let's go down this road because we want to learn this. And part of that is we want to learn it because we want to be able to speak more intelligently about it. And get out of our echo chamber, right?
I have an expanded context for the NoSQL side that I definitely didn't have before. That is very true.
And we're a week into it. By the time we finish building this product, you'll be further down, and we will have jumped off a couple of those cliffs, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That we know to avoid in the relational world. So that was point one that I wanted to grab on, because I think it's really important. It's one of the reasons why you and I keep building, keep learning on our own. We can go out and hire somebody to build this thing for us.
Yeah.
But if we build it, if we learn what's needed, we keep our noses as to what's relevant. That doesn't mean we're no SQL devotees. Far from it at the moment, but we're more intelligent about it now.
Well, I think in hindsight, I should have done this a long time ago. When I was a CTO at Innovations for Learning, we never really we had a product that probably could have used the high speed transactional side of things for at least for one of our products. And I didn't go down that path because I just didn't know enough about NoSQL. And what I should have done is pretty much what I just sat down and did part of Saturday, and which was watch some videos of people building stuff in NoSQL. I don't care about their stack. Like, to learn this piece of the stack, I don't need to know the whole thing. And I think that was my brain has had to change. And this is what I think tech leaders need to kind of get, is that you don't need to know the low level details of a stack to learn enough to start building context to make your choices.
There you go.
But it's
That's right.
hard. It's hard to just go based on the conjecture, kind of like the Python 2.3 debate that I was focused on.
Right.
How important was that? I don't think it's that important, but I based a lot of my Python choices or lack of them based on that divide I saw, or maybe I was making that an excuse. I could have watched some tutorials, videos with someone building in Python, and I'd see how it mapped to what I already knew. And that's why learning NoSQL is a lot easier, I think, than because I have this full context for how SQL works, and I'm mapping the contrast between NoSQL and SQL, and I'm able to see like, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's not that big of a change.
Right. And I think that's important for us, and I'm further down this road than you are. But I think it's important for us as we age to keep doing that, because brain elasticity goes away as you age.
Yep.
And the only way to maintain it is to jump in like this.
Yeah.
So it keeps us relevant. And that's, if there's a point to make there, it's even if you're not diving into the code, do some reading. Get out of your echo chamber, get out of what's comfortable. This goes back earlier to what you were saying about a tech leader coming in and changing what the team has already built.
Yeah.
In some cases, that's a good idea. If the team is stuck in a rut on an old technology, it may be worth evaluating. Do we need to move to something newer? But it's not always the right case. So it's worth an evaluation. I think, and the last point I wanted to make on NoSQL, and we'll wrap up here. The last point I wanted to make is, I think this all came about right about when we all started to discover that storage was getting infinitely cheaper. Because as you said, you're repeating a lot of things in NoSQL. So the cost of storage matters. When the cost of storage went down, all of a sudden you can repeat these things all over the place, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But it does make it more performant. So
that
was the last piece I wanted to bring up there.
Another part of the stack, and this is what I think leads a little bit to the NoSQL, is the transmission payloads. When we use APIs and our apps talk to each other or talk to servers, we started out in SOAP and some other formats I don't ever really know. CSV is actually considered a format. And I think the web industry kind of started to go down the XML path. And people weren't really overly happy with that format for data transmission. And JSON, JavaScript object notation, kind of took over as this is the best way to transmit data between two different clients or servers with, over an API. And then people are like, well, why aren't we storing our data the same way that we're transmitting it? What's the problem with that? And so that's a little bit that led to it. But your part of your stack is that transmission piece. How are you going to provide? And there are firms that do APIs that provide XML and JSON. And then there are firms, God help me, I had to work with one that did tab-based delimiters in a file. And I'm like, you are old. Like, this is old as dirt. And even the support team was like, we apologize for this file we're sending you, But that transmission piece is part of your stack. And it's an important thing because it really affects your support for external firms that may use your data for your company. So
for sure, we with Aspire EDU, we're still asked to produce CSV files for a number of clients for input into their systems.
I did it last week for a client. I did that last week for a vendor. So I
get the feeling CSV never goes away. It's one of those technologies that we're going to use forever.
Yep. Now we've avoided talking about, not avoided, we just haven't got to the one stack. We kind of talked about it on the fringe, JavaScript. Like that is the stack of the moment. in terms of web
The
development.
the language of the moment, and it drives other decisions within the stack.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we are doing side projects. We've started to switch to a more JavaScript based stack. The course I taught at Northwestern is basically a coding boot camp for front and back end full stack development. All of it's JavaScript. Like, we do teach MySQL Relational a little bit, but Firebase and Mongo are the two main data stores that we teach. And the students would continually ask me, why are you teaching JavaScript? And is this the best thing for us to learn? And hey, you're Ruby. Why don't we learning Ruby? And from a looking at the landscape, looking at the growth, looking at the industry, learning JavaScript, which is to me way harder to learn than Ruby, is still the better. Like, you'll be able to employ this. JavaScript runs across the full stack in like farther than any other language I've seen. JavaScript can go across the full stack. And so learning that as your base language gives a person more options. At the same token, a CTO that is part of a startup is looking to, how can I have my development team less segmented on front and back end? Using JavaScript in a way allows you to do that.
Right.
If you look at the new providers out there for hosting, you see that all of their options, like I can tell you right now, one of my motivations for getting deeper into JavaScript was that I started to see less Ruby examples for all the providers out there. Whether I was looking at Auth0, their Ruby support is weak. Why? Not because they're dropping the ball, but there's not a lot of demand. They were following the demand, and the demand was Node. The demand was Android and iOS native. And so
Right.
they focused there. There were providers were going to, and they don't even have Ruby examples at all. I see that on the AWS stack right now. They're Firebase too. Ruby and Rails is not even part of their discussion, and it has to do with developer demand. And that starts to tell you, like, not that Ruby's dying, but it's not is growing as fast as the others. And so Node is one where I feel it's very efficient for me to be part of that stack going forward more, because I can get more done. And I know if I'm building a product, I can hire developers that can work across the stack easier.
Right. And JavaScript from a tech executive standpoint probably deserves its own deep dive.
Yeah.
Probably deserves its own episode. One thing I wanted to grab onto that you just said was, you talked about how Ruby isn't being provided examples for. And you said that not because it's dying, but because it's not growing as quickly. And I think that's something that, as an executive, to wrap all this up, I think as an executive, that's something to be very sensitive to.
Sure.
It is very easy, extremely easy to get caught up in what's hot.
Yeah.
What is hot is not necessarily what is best, is almost certainly not what is best, and is also not necessarily what has the best support, what is the best for your application, that sort of thing. There's still a significant portion of applications and systems using Ruby on Rails, even though if you were to look at growth, Ruby and Rails are way down the list.
Yeah.
There's still significant support and a significant number of systems out there.
So let me, in order this not to become a Ruby is dying or Rails is dying meme, I will say that Rails released 5.2 version 5.2. The releases are very stable these days, meaning you don't find yourself stuck where I can't move forward with this update.
Right.
And I've got to upgrade a ton of stuff. But they just added the killer feature that I feel like has been people have wanted for a while, which is tying Rails to back-end file storage, whether it's on S3 or Google Cloud.
Sure.
And all of a sudden they dropped in this feature in the Rails platform that's like, whoa, you are solving a huge problem. And in a way, I'm like, oh, I just started learning more Node and I'm giving up that new feature, which is what I've wanted for years. And so DHH and the Rails community is still strong as heck. Like they are still producing great stuff. They do security updates. The community still has people talking. It's not dying. It's mature. And
all right, so you've well defended the Rails community now.
but here's a flip side. This is one of the reasons why I didn't want to go to Firebase. It has to do with Google. I grew up in an era where the Google stack of applications were just retired without any thought. And Firebase's predecessor in the world was Parse. And Parse was bought by Facebook. And Parse had momentum like Firebase does now. And Facebook just said, we don't want this anymore. We're not going to be in the business of providing services like this. And they just killed it. And so given Google had killed off like a note-taking app and the Google Reader at one point, and their support has typically been just horrid. Like they just don't talk to you. Like they're like, here are all these cool free tools, but we're not going to support. I was like, why do I want to invest a company or a client in this stack when the history of Google is, if this doesn't work out, we're going to just drop you like a rock. And that's what you have to consider with your stacks, is that
for sure
that Rails stability, that Python stability, or the hotness and the fact that the parent company has never been straight with the development community. Now, people have been arguing, I've been reading it, oh no, Google's so invested, they'll never drop this. That would be, they would look so bad. I'm like, when has looking bad ever mattered when billions of dollars are on the line? Like it doesn't, and you can't make those bets, you can make those bets. You just got to know the risk. So I'm still not 100% on Firebase simply for the fact that what if Google gets bored with this, and this is not the way they want to go right now? Nothing says that to me that they want to, but I just don't always trust Google when it comes to, if this doesn't become a big enterprise level investment from the community, will they drop it? And that's
fair.
I don't know.
That's a fair thing to look into when considering.
So,
all right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up for today. Cool. We've got more work to do. I think it's another weekend of coding, and we'll see where we come out. I think we're close to launching a test version of it, so we can run it by a small group of people. So.
Awesome. And maybe we'll be talking more about this project on this old app because it's more in the
absolutely.
So eventually we'll be posting episodes where we kind of have more one-on-one conversations related to the project. Only other thing I'll add for those folks listening, we never really pitch like, hey, leave us reviews on iTunes, and that's something you hear on a lot of podcasts, and I've kind of been like self-promotion, but we need reviews. Like it's helpful. It gets the word out. It does help Apple recognize your podcast. So if you have time, you don't have to actually write a ton. You can just say, here's a number of stars and thumbs up or something, or I wish they'd talk more about other stuff. I'm not trying to push what stars you choose, but reviews on iTunes would help. We'd appreciate if you could leave us a few.
Yeah, please do.
All right.
All right, very good. Thank you, Randy. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the CTO Think podcast. Show notes and previous episodes can be found on our website at ctothink.com. Reviews on Apple iTunes are always appreciated and help promote the show. Patreon contributions help us to produce episode transcripts, which allow people that are deaf or hard of hearing to access the show. If you have feedback, ideas, or want to be a guest, please email us at hello@ctothink.com. Show music is Dumpster Dive by Mark Wallach, licensed by premiumbeat.com. Voiceover work by meganvoices.com. You'll hear from us next week.